think we're ready to take a few questions from the audience here, and I know there was somebody at the back before lunch who actually had a question that he wanted answered or had a comment.
There's a way at the back.
Yeah, that's she's
mic.
going to get the mic.
Yeah, I just want to say that this panel has been instructive in terms of us coming from the community, in terms of what we're doing, and we think we also have a lot to teach this panel in terms of what is going on in the community. We think that in terms of New Orleans, the three major areas of struggle, which have been over the public schools, public housing, and public health, that's also an international issue in that you have this whole struggle over whether public utilities will stay public or go private. And that question is being posed most sharply in New Orleans. We've had some setbacks over the struggle for public housing, but the struggle for public health is growing in intensity, and this is the battle over Charity Hospital. We think that battle merits study, not just here, but around the world in terms of its component parts, because what's involved here is not just the intensity of the healthcare crisis in New Orleans since Katrina, but also the involvement of, on the one hand, the preservationist community, mainly organized in the Foundation for Historical Louisiana and the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and various community groups. And those community groups are increasing in terms of their participation in this struggle over charity. We've had two big community meetings in the past week. We've had a hearing before the state legislature. And one of the most interesting products to issue forth from this struggle, which was a direct contribution from the preservationist community, is the study, the feasibility study of charity by R.M.J.M. Hilliard. We think that the Hilliard report deserves a seminar in its own right in terms of how a public building was studied and found to be able to be reused, to be rehabbed into a modern 21st century hospital. In terms of the whole Gulf Coast recovery, we think the Hilliard report is one of the most profound documents to issue from the whole struggle since Katrina and Rita, because we have not been able to get into the schools and do a examination of the schools and figure out how they can be rehabbed into modern facilities. We weren't able to get into public housing and show that public housing could be rehabbed rather than torn down, but we have been able to get into charity. And so the report by R.M.J.M. Hilliard merits a lot of study. And we hope that also this seminar will provoke some discussion amongst the faculty and students of the Tulane School of Architecture, because we hope that that discussion helps them become involved in the struggle over charity. Because one of the next big mobilization dates for charity is February 12th. We're calling for a community gathering in front of Charity Thursday, February 12th, between 4 and 5, where we will present a proposal that the elected officials consider the Hilliard report. And we think that that merits the participation of everybody in the New Orleans metro area. Thank you.
Thank you. Comments here.
Well, I wonder whether the Tulane School of Architecture or members of that community could do what they often do best, which is help people see ideas. And you can almost envision a charrette, you know, an intense period of work that would take the Hilliard report and make it visible in nice and concise images. And maybe the thing to do is to explore whether that's something that can be done quickly in time for the February 12th meeting, and what will be turned over will be a portfolio of visions, both creative, imaginative, energetic, as a way of beginning to let people see the possibilities, see what a hospital complex built upon and integrated into the existing fabric would look like, and hold that up against the proposals that are on the table that involve total demolition. And I think that's a good way to get people thinking and discussing and all the rest. So maybe there's a way for Tulane to discharge some of their community involvement.
To unabashedly promote a program of my organization, I mentioned this World Monuments Watch program, and all of New Orleans and the Gulf Coast were put on the watch list after Katrina. But it was this sort of global nomination without any specific projects being generated. And I think just today and yesterday we did a tour of a number of sites. Charity Hospital, the Wheatley School, these are all terrific nominations to the watch list. The deadline is March 15th. All the information is online at wmf.org, and I think that there are a lot of opportunities, if only to get that kind of more globalized media coverage for some of these issues. And then to go directly to what this gentleman commented on, and what's so amazingly refreshing to hear is that preservation becomes a tool for much broader social aims. You know, charity is the symbol for public health. It's not simply that you all want to save that building, as much as there's a whole set of issues that are embodied in the debate regarding charity that speak to much broader political and social issues that aren't being adequately addressed in the community. And so it's wonderful to hear when preservation is not just the end, but rather the means to much broader and bigger ends that really help to sustain the community.
Maybe one of the broader and bigger ends is actually to begin to use this as something that rehabilitates the notion of public. If you think for 30 years now, public has taken a bath in terms of the perception of what that is. It's public transportation, as you say, public housing, public education, all viewed negatively. And I wonder whether there's a way of beginning to frame this as a public project that actually gives people a sense of optimism and hope and starts reinvesting, just as you would reinvest in these buildings, it starts rehabilitating the notion of public itself. And I think that'd be very exciting.
Excellent. Right here.
We've been talking about sense of place early this morning, and Mr. Lowe was the first person to talk about the word neighborhood. And I would recommend that we forget about the sense of place and incorporate it into the sense of neighborhood. I know General Oglethorpe, when he founded Savannah, Georgia in 1734, understood this perfectly, because every plaza or square of the 24 squares is a neighborhood, with 10 houses on each side, but public institutions at each end, schools, hospitals, city halls, all the things that each neighborhood needs, with the residential on two sides and the other things, including commercial, at each end. And if place may be considered private or it may be considered public, but a neighborhood is for everything. And I will defend inventories, because inventories make people love their neighborhoods. And this has certainly been proven in New Orleans. One example is, I don't think there was a lower garden district 40 years ago. There were a bunch of places that the Irish had moved into when they had to come to town and ruined Bartholomew Lafoe's fancy, lovely neighborhood. But just by saying, oh, there's a lower garden district below the garden district. And now I have met two doctors who are from Germany, live in one of my houses in Charlottesville, and they say, oh, we used to live in the lower garden district in New Orleans. And so I can think that neighborhoods might be everything, everywhere, because they are public and private, and they provide a sense of pride for all of the people, no matter what their economic condition may be.
Comment.
My criticism of inventories doesn't mean that I'm not a proponent of them. More that I think we've had a curatorial tradition in our approach toward inventories, rather than looking at inventories as a tool for social engagement. And what you've just said really is that, that inventory of the Lower Garden District really was a tool for social engagement, in that it created a constituency around which you could create an historic district. And when we use our inventories in that way, we're facilitating that kind of building of social capital that was discussed earlier today, and not simply creating a repository of information that never goes beyond particular institutions or particular professional hands. So,
any other? Yes, right here.
The Hillier project comes with an extremely vivid 15-minute video, and for many people the other night, it was the first time they'd ever seen it. And it's unfortunate that it's been kept under a basket so that its light couldn't shine, but it's very well done. So the homework you were discussing, they've already done it for us. It really just needs to get out there and to see that this is not just a raggedy old hospital we've kind of taped up and put up, but it's good looking. And they've kept a few good things about the building that are very sexy and sensuous and artistic, like the Great Hall and stuff. But the building was built so far beyond its time. That's what they were saying, that God, to get a building today with 17-foot ceilings on the surgery floors and 12.6 for all the other floors. We couldn't afford that today. And they've got wonderful, and it looks beautiful. It makes you want to just walk in the door as opposed to run away from it. But unfortunately, the whole issue gets down in this case to how the school would be run and who gives up power. And if they don't do moving out of Charity Hospital, they have to deal with one board of directors, where if they move out of it, they get to set up their new board of directors and be totally autonomous. And I don't know where Tulane fits in all this, because they never talk about Tulane. But Tulane is necessary for Charity Hospital to work, or a teaching hospital to work.
Well, let's just discuss this here on the panel. That's an interesting question, because really it's a question of co-opting other constituents in preservation issues. And in the case of Charity, what we've heard, the demolition of 70 blocks and moving on to a new campus. But many of the questions that you raise have to do with governance. They have to do with economy. They have to do with dollars flow. That's, dollars flowing into the state. What about, and I'm not talking about Charity here, I'm talking about other preservation issues. And I'm looking for examples of, or thinking about projects where the issues are not purely the sites or the buildings or even the communities. I'm talking about this plethora of other issues that go with preservation. Ownership, power, economy. Some comments, please, from you all, just in thinking about other problematic or even successful work where people have engaged leaders, clients, owners, politicians, the other dynamic that goes into.
Well, there are two dynamics to that that I immediately sense. One is money, lots of it, and where it comes from and who controls it. And the second question, which people have difficulty with because there is a cost to it, and the word is leadership. No one likes to be out there by themselves. And sometimes it takes that special individual, that special group of individuals to say, I'm going to help lead this, or I am in fact going to lead this. So often we wait for individuals to say they're the leader and somebody wants to follow. And we don't take the time to really understand that collectively it's us that we have to do this. To a large degree, the issue about leadership, though, is interconnected with education. Because in order to be able to be a good leader, you have to know full well, excuse the expression, who's trying to beat who. Think about it. Who's trying to beat who? The gentleman raised some interesting points about public education, I think it was public health, public housing, et cetera, et cetera. But as we use the term public, what we're talking about is us. Because us is the tax dollars about public transportation, public education, public housing. It's us. It's our dollars that are engaged in this whole discussion. And because it's our dollars that's engaged in this whole discussion, we're all leaders in this discussion. And at the end of the day, the community has a big stake in this. And unfortunately, I think to some degree, those who are silent about this do as much damage as anything else, because it gives those who control the resources the belief that somehow preservation or we are loonies, etc. And it's a false impression out there. It will, when you look at this in terms of the resources, this is Stanley speaking. It's not representing anyone. But when you look at the resources that comes to New Orleans, and you do the percentage quota about this, you know, they say follow the money coming out of Washington that comes to the state that ultimately gets here. If you just track the money and figure out where it's going and who controls what's doing what and where it goes, a lot of this stuff would really become revealing. So when we talk about this whole issue of public, when we tag this thing public onto it, to me, the first question I ask is, who's leading this? Who's making these decisions? Why are the decisions not necessarily public decisions? The last piece to this is, I don't know if New Orleans has, or if the state has, or if the county has, the whole issue of public disclosure. I'm speaking a foreign language here.
Nationally, it's called transparency.
Transparency. That is so. To me, that is so important. I used to work for a community group, and they asked me to do a little technical assistance for them about a month ago. So I get an urgent call. There are about 5 or 6 people asking for financial statements from the community group. And they're saying, well, what do we do? What do we do? And I said, you got to be kidding. Give it to them. Shovel it out the door. By not turning over the data, you are giving the appearance that you have something to hide. It's true with us as well. We have to think about, when we use the word public, who is we? We're the leaders of this. And that's why I really go back and applaud those who are raising the issues about public housing, about charity, whatnot. Think about what the noise decibel level would be. Think about what the noise decibel level would be if it weren't for the preservationists.
Excellent. Okay. I assume, well, I think we've got time for one more question here. There's one right on the front row. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, before you close, I was hoping we could turn it back to international for a minute. You know, I think that there's a lot in global and international contacts, but as Ned said, I think the regional contacts are so important, because if we look at the Circum-Caribbean, or the greater Circum-Caribbean, I mean, we share so much in terms of history, in terms of ecology, in terms of race relations, in terms of colonialism, etc. So there's a natural affinity to build, you know, across those areas. But I think we also have to be very, very careful when we look at the complexity we talked about this morning of preservation education, that we not take little forays of a technical nature to the region, but that we need people who speak the language, who know the history, who have lived and experienced the lives of those people with whom they're working. And I think Tulane also has a wonderful tradition in the School of Architecture, because so many Puerto Ricanos have come here and studied, so many from the Dominican Republic. So there's more exchange rates going on there that really kind of create very, very real and deep relationships across that region. But I just think we have to be careful, you know, that it's not, in area studies we talk about the pokers and the soakers. Right? You need a couple of soakers who go down there and really soak up the culture, and not just fly in and helicopter out.
Right.
Partnerships.
Partnerships, exactly, yeah.
Okay, I think we're Jorge, I think, speaking of Puerto Rico, would you care to make a few remarks to us, please, about preservation education?
Sure. I'll narrow the focus of the discussion a little bit to go at some specific recommendations or possibilities for architectural education to open up to preservation. As we have seen here today, reflecting upon the future of preservation forces us to come to terms with the field's extended range of physical, social, and psychological impact. An impact customarily measured in terms of how much is saved, and that word saved uttered often to highlight the alleged redemptive character or quality of our advocacy. Indeed, much has been saved, even though we complain a lot, but much has been saved since the early years of the preservation movement. However, the tension inherent to the task, as we've seen today, remains unrelenting. For every person aware of the importance of architectural conservation, there will always be 10 that succumb to that adrenaline rush granted by all things new. And as teachers, we must acknowledge that all the time. It has been like that for ages, and ironically, preservationists thrive on it. If we are capable of enjoying the legacy of traditional architecture and also simultaneously stand in awe of the modern movement, it is because we stand for change. So much, in fact, that in spite of all our frustrations, we have indeed succeeded at transforming private, public, and political perceptions regarding preservation. Activism, community involvement, and graduate programs in conservation have enhanced the quality of the debate. That is, in fact, what gathers us here today. For years, Tulane and Jean Sisek have acknowledged the importance of an expanded preservation scope, reaching out of the classroom to organize communities, engage children in design, or challenge city administrators one after the other. Professor Sisek's background seemed perfectly honed for this task. He studied, and his resume shows, neighborhood studies, urban design, and landscape architecture. That's, from the 60s to the 21st century. And all the concerns are there in his original training. Now, because not all schools have gene to transcend traditional expectations regarding what preservationists think should be done, it is up to each school to rethink how to go about it. That is my main point about it, because schools always, in these kinds of events, get all sorts of recommendations, and everybody goes home, and the schools are left with an impossible agenda of things to fulfill. So it is up to each school to rethink how to go about it. After all, the best recipes come from home cooking. At Polytechnic University of Puerto Rico, where I had the opportunity of designing the architectural curriculum from scratch, preservation was addressed as both an end and a means. The first thing we did, we set up an architectural conservation laboratory, the only one nowadays operating in the Caribbean. Students were involved in projects of national importance. I was going to say iconic pieces, I'd rather say compelling pieces of high visibility within the community. Then the other ones followed afterwards. Because then public recognition came through, funds and grants followed. It was one big snowball, even though we don't have snow. And we succeeded, no small feat for a school in the periphery, in being respected for our technological dexterity and achievements. Now, this laboratory exists in support of our 5-year bachelor's degree program in architecture. It is not part of a graduate program. We do not have a graduate program in preservation so far. It serves every student, architecture student enrolled in the school. I am convinced, as both an academic and a practitioner, that besides promoting preservation as a field of specialization, simultaneously, we must insist that all architects and landscape architects are trained to dominate the skills of a preservationist, regardless of whether they end up or not directly engaged in the field of conservation. Architects are, after all, some of the key people preservationists have to fight. So it seems proper that the education is broadened to be inclusive about both of them. At Polytechnic University, freshmen learn to see and draft by drawing existing buildings of relative stylistic complexity, as Jean mentioned before. The idea as such is not new, it's very Beaux-Arts in a way. And around 1907, 1908, the curriculum here at Tulane required students to spend 2 summers documenting Greek Revival and Neo-Gothic structures. Anyone who has measured a historic building knows how much it means in your training. As sophomores, then, students at Polytechnic have to take a history of architecture of the Caribbean in order to better serve the region and develop an empathy of the place where they are being trained. It is a required course, and it comes from a pedagogical concept adhering to famous Brazilian educator Paulo Freire's dictum, that learning starts from what you are familiar with and then goes on to other things. By third year, everyone enrolls in a required preservation studio, one that is integral to the design sequence. And in that course, they do archival research, surveying and recording, as well as design. It is all framed within the debate of architectural theories regarding old and new, experiences with direct experience, hands-on, with the aging of materials in order to create an awareness of maintenance and the conservation of buildings. And the examples throughout the years have been chosen from community needs. So they have to go into the community and identify which are the elements that will best serve the project. It didn't take us too long to find out that this preservation studio for undergraduates in architecture, with all it encompasses, fulfills the largest number of criteria established by the National Architectural Accrediting Board for educating architects in one single course. Not preservationists, I underline, but just plain architects. I could pursue the point further, for the effort at developing professionals through skills regularly associated with preservation extends to later years in training, by courses on historiography, microhistory, oral history, which are all part of the requirements needed for graduation. But I will just say, it has worked for us to think of preservation as more than an end, but as a means. Architects with such training now are in private practice, holding positions in government, and of course, many of them are attending graduate school in preservation. This strategy has worked for us, but what was our blueprint for the future of an architect's education, our idea of how to go about it, could only stimulate other people to do the same or go further. Every school should find its own. Other ideas have been voiced here today, and some are quite important in acknowledging the possibility of strengthening an interdisciplinary approach much more than the one we have assumed so far. What Charles Kohlberg, a former alum at Tulane, once said regarding ornamentation today proves relevant upon addressing preservation education and finding alternate venues. He said, seek idea beyond everything else, to seek a way to influence the future, not just decorate the present. If our outlook on preservation stimulates others to do the same or do better, we will be more than happy. Thank you very much.
Interesting discussion and somewhat distinct from the way the level of some of the conversations that we've had, which involves a very particular methodology that you're describing in education. We've heard about a variety of needs. From the panel, what about, from your own perspective, about about preservation education? And in this case, related to architecture and preservation, but what about the education of the preservationist in general? What are the other panelists' thoughts?
I think maybe we have to rethink the term architecture school as we rethink the term preservation and begin to get to a place that acknowledges what I think you said at the beginning and what Jorge has now put back on the table, which is that I actually heard it's more than 50%. It's closer to 70% of architects' billable hours go into existing buildings. Mm-hmm. And beginning to re-envision architectural education as something that actually takes that seriously and looks to do that not as a patch-up, but as a arena for great creativity, ingenuity, ecological and environmental responsibility, would be very exciting. And I think that as we rethink along Tom's suggestion that maybe we need to expand or rethink the term preservation, maybe we really need to get serious about thinking or rethinking what it is to train an architect today.
I'd like to talk about that a bit too. We've had innumerable conversations in public arenas and so forth about the fascination in architecture schools with, well, I don't know what the term would be, but let's say invention over the last decade. And we've come through a period of material prosperity that has been unprecedented. That period brought with it, in the United States, it brought with it a certain amount of experimentation, invention, innovation in building materials and systems, the digital technology revolution, which changed our ability to essentially think. I mean, it literally becomes a tool and a new way of thinking about the way that we make things. At the same time, we've seen in the larger culture an explosion of building with a variety of results, some of which we would admire and some of which are not admirable. And we've also seen an explosion of scales. We were talking at lunch with someone who talked about, we talked about just the scale of houses and how large they have become and how much more literally land area they're taking up. It's not at all uncommon now, and I think it's, in fact, I may be wrong on my statistic here, but I believe I heard that the norm now is for a 4-car garage in certain developments. I mean, that boggles my mind as currently as a New Yorker. But nevertheless, this economic change is going to provoke real change in not only our perceptions of what is desirable, but what we should be making. And I mean, it may force a change in our value systems and aspirations of our clients and the people that we are working for and with. It may, in fact, force a change toward looking at reuse and adaptation and all the issues that we've been discussing here. Any comments on that from others here? Just on, let's just say the economic moment affecting some sort of larger change in the zeitgeist, something about thinking about who we are and what we want.
Well, the trouble with relying on the economic situation to do that is that as soon as the economic situation changes again, we've lost whatever we've gained. So maybe the economic situation provides us an opportunity to make some changes in the system that would outlast future economic changes. And I like Jorge's model very much. Some of the reasons that both you and Dan have said, it makes our job as preservation educators a lot easier. It solves a lot of our problems. One of them being the kind of second-class status that preservation design often has in architecture schools. I think it allows us to, as researchers and practitioners as well as teachers, to focus on some other things that only we can do. Many of us as preservationists cannot actually design. All we can do is whine and complain about how other people do it. But if the designers will take care of that, then we can focus on other things that we're actually better trained to think about. But it also latches onto a bigger potential. To some extent, the idea of preservation education training preservationists is a dead end, because of course we need to train technicians, but if that's all we do in preservation education, then we can't ever really change the system, because by the time the technicians that we train get their hands on the situation, the big decisions are already made. So if we could use the platform of a preservation education program to train architects, to change the way architects are trained, to reach lawyers, to get preservation into the curriculum of the business school, public health, and so on. If we could train all the people who haven't come to our door because they already know they want what we have, then that would be a huge step forward for preservation education.
Don't they have to want this, though? I mean, pardon me, you say business schools, I know.
In the schools too, and it's interesting would be interesting to know how Jorge got the architecture. Well, we don't advertise as a preservation school. Yeah. We just have preservation at the level of other requirements. Right. So it's like a given for those who come. And of course, a school has a long life, so you can experiment with different things. Partnerships have been vital. We work with the University of Pennsylvania, and we've had graduate students from Penn working with our undergraduates. The World Monument Fund, the students actually worked for one of the projects to be included in the most endangered building, to be included in the most endangered list a couple of years ago. I think it's a matter of putting it up to par with the rest of the things in training and not just have the preservation studio for the few of those who are in tune with that mystique, I guess. Nowadays, we are, for example, pursuing the interest in concrete, so the Architectural Conservation Laboratory is working on aging in concrete, so that students also know when they are designing all these overhangs and wonderful things to know what it means and how they can actually bear witness to the fact in the existing structures on the island. It's pretty much connected, as much as it's possible.
Bob, your sense of whether this can be made compelling, attractive to other units of the university or other units of the community, I think a lot of what we've been talking about today are ways of reconceiving and repositioning what architecture is, what preservation is, in a way that it's inescapably compelling. And by the time you've put on the table citizenship, social equity, environmental, global warming issues, heritage, attachment to place, that's something that I think even the accountants can begin to respond to in the business school. That this is a vision of the fabric of our community that other professionals are going to want to participate in. And I think you're actually already seeing it. You're seeing increasingly in business school or even in ads for corporations, them playing up their global climate and sustainability requirements. This would give substance to all of that, and I think that it wouldn't be hard to begin to get people actually just out of self-interest.
Let me just one last comment, because I forgot. You questioned before about the technology and the digital aspect and the relationship to preservation. I think there's a connection there that works wonderful in schools, because we deal with the most advanced technologies, and when the students get involved with the digital representation, ground penetrating radar, and the marvelous things that come out of all of these, we bring specialists that participate. You suddenly have a whole different crew of people that are interested in the field at undergraduate level. So it's a great complement, the technological aspect nowadays.
I think, I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's okay.
No, go.
I want to open up this context for a second and speak to some of the issues of the international realm and in particular the regional realm that is so important vis-a-vis architecture. An interesting statistic out of Oxford Brookes University, I believe. 80% of the world's population lives in vernacular housing, meaning it is owner-built and occupied. There are no architects involved. So we're talking about a profession that's servicing 20% of the world's population. And I believe that preservation needs to definitely be well integrated within that profession, but at the same time, if we look at our built environment around the globe, we have to recognize that most of the things we're dealing with doesn't really come out of that profession. And that's a sobering issue, particularly in architecture schools. And part of why we really haven't quite embraced that is similarly this internationalization, this standardization of architecture practice that has moved around the world, but really hasn't embedded itself within the ways in which populations determine or self-determine their environments. So it's an important thing, because I think the last thing we want to do is create a situation where we disempower that percentage of the people in the world by saying, no, our built environment should be determined by professionals.
Well, this is part of preservationists being good listeners in communities, because I think in some ways we can start interpreting the insights of that for people that have insights about building systems, structural systems, technological systems, ecological systems within their grasp. And I think in some ways preservation potentially can play that role of introducing that world of the 80% to people that are training as architects. I think they can do that very effectively.